Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Fiction. My name is Melanie McNair. I am the Senior Director of Public Programming here. It's great to see so many people who love short stories here, right? You love short stories, right? How many of you are visiting us for the first time this evening? Okay, welcome, and welcome to all of you who are coming back. Please come back again. We love to see you. The Center for Fiction is a home for readers and writers. If you don't know, we also do reading groups and writing workshops, and there's a whole slate of new ones for the spring season that just went on our website. So check those out if that's of interest to you. Our partners this evening are the Royal Norwegian Consulate General, who generously sponsored Gunnhild's travel and our reception this evening, and Harper's Magazine, which is the oldest general interest monthly in America and publishes fine new writing, including, of course, great short fiction. So thank you to both of those organizations and all the people at both places that help make this happen. I also want to say a special hello to those of you who are joining us on the live stream tonight. A few housekeeping announcements. We will have an audience Q&A, and we'll need for you to raise your hand and wait for a microphone to come to you to ask a question so that the people who are watching online can hear the question as well. And if you're watching online, you can type your question in the chat at any time. We'll get to a couple of those questions before we wrap up the evening. And when the event is over, you can go out those back doors and purchase books from one of our three fabulous authors this evening, and then come back in here and get in line to have the books personalized. Right, let me introduce our moderator for the evening. Joanna Biggs is a senior editor at Harper's Magazine. She's the author of A Life of One's Own, 9 Women Writers Begin Again, which will be published by Echo in May, and we will have an event for her in May, so please come back. Welcome to the stage, Joanna.
Good evening. Thank you all so much for coming. It's raining, I see, outside, so you've done very brave to have made it. We are extremely lucky tonight to have Hernan Diaz, Chakrabarti, and Gunnhild Øyehaug with us tonight. Come on in. Don't wait for rain. I'll just introduce them briefly and then we'll get straight to the discussion. As Melanie said, there will be questions, so do you have a think while we're talking if there's anything you'd like to ask. So Hernan Diaz, as a lot of you will know, he's the author of In the Distance, which is a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and Trust, one of the New York Times' 10 best books in 2022. He's published short stories too, in Granta, Playboy, and the Paris Review, and has a very elegant, satisfying story called Triptych in the new March issue of Harper's Magazine. Jai Chakrabarti's novel, A Play for the End of the World, won the National Jewish Book Award for debut fiction, and his collection of short stories, A Small Sacrifice for an Enormous Happiness, came out yesterday, in fact. His stories have been anthologized in the Pushcart Prize and the O. Henry Prize collections, as well as in the Best American Short Stories. Gunnhild Øyehaug, her short story collection, Knots, first appeared in the US in 2017 to a rapturous reception. James Woody, you might remember, called her work playful, often surreal, intellectually rigorous, and brief in the New Yorker. Her new collection, Evil Flowers, was translated by Carrie Dixon and came out on Valentine's Day. Probably one of the nicer things to happen on that day. 2 of her novels have appeared in English, Wait, Blink, and Present Tense Machine, which Claire Massoud called splendidly clever in Harper's Magazine last year. Gunnhild also writes criticism, essays, and poetry in her native Norway. I'm going to draw them all out a little bit on their books, and we'll have some few readings, but I wanted to start just by asking you all, probably a slightly horrible question. How do you know when an idea is a short story and not a novel and not an essay or not a poem and not a bit of criticism? Hernan, do you want to start with that?
Oh, thank you.
Don't worry, I've got worse questions.
Oh, gosh, I feel, thank you all for being here, by the way, and so lovely to meet all of you. I should have prepared an answer for this question. I think, for me, a short story has a prerequisite, which is that it should question its own form in its own execution. All the short stories that I'm interested in do this. I'm also interested in vignette-like short stories, which belong in a different kind of universe. But I feel I'm more interested in short stories that pose the question of their own form to themselves.
Can you think of an example, apart from your own work?
I think most of Borges's stories, for example, by the time you get to the end of the story, you're being asked as a reader to reconsider all the parameters you had that the story had established for itself, and therefore to you, and recalibrate your experience of the text. I think he does this in almost every story. I, for one, normally start out thinking this is going to be a short story. It's also whatever is more manageable in terms of length. That's the most obvious distinction between both forms. But I recently did this experiment. I was working on a novel that didn't quite work, and I thought, what if I took all of this mass and condensed it into a short story? And that was, it's not this one, it's a different one. But that made
it worked.
me, I don't know. I finished it. But that made me rethink my own taxonomies. I'm a little suspicious of taxonomies to begin with, and of a normative approach to literature. This ought to be this ought to be that. So yeah, so it's hence my hesitation.
Okay. And you, Jai?
Yeah, and so great to be here. Thank you all for coming out in the rain and the cold. But I love that reclamation of the novel as a short story. I don't think I've been able to pull that off, so I have something to aspire to now. And when I think about novels and short stories, I guess in general I think about them as perhaps a kind of technology which is asking this question of how should one live? And in the short story, I think that you can do it quickly and with a less amount of space that you're taking up to do it, and you can have discrete moments. Whereas in the novel, it's kind of like you're stuck on a desert island, is how I feel. In that movie with Tom Hanks and the soccer ball, I kind of feel like the novel is the soccer ball. You can't get rid of it. Whereas the short story, you can come into it and you can leave. So from the perspective of myself as a writer, the short story allows for this freedom of walking in and walking out. And the novel, I guess, is a kind of different sort of rigor. And when I think about my first novel, I think that changed me because of that austerity, because of that living on an island in a way that perhaps the short story doesn't capture as much of. So that's more from, I guess, the personal perspective of the experience of writing it.
Yeah, for me it's been, I think I always believe that I'm embarking on a short story whenever I start writing. And then it turns out, particularly the second novel I wrote, I recognized a certain resistance in the material. I wasn't able to go on with it. I was trying to write about a woman who was dancing with a man she didn't want to dance with on very slippery floor. And there was something about, I wanted it to become a short story because I couldn't tolerate that situation. It was horrible. But I was never able to go on with it. And there was a little voice inside my head trying to tell me that I think you have started a novel because this is a situation that will demand some kind of different effort from you, because why is this situation so horrible? I mean, sometimes a short story can resolve that very quickly, but this was something that kind of involved her entire being, and I had to have much more space to try to explore her situation. So that was kind of, I always think about that when I reluctantly begin a new novel. I sense that kind of reluctance within the material, that I have to have more space.
It's not reluctance, it's not resistance that you have. You feel it's like the situation won't like bend or end when you want it to, or something like that.
Yeah. And so it's always, and sometimes it's, I think it's with some of the last novel, it was kind of a feeling I had that it was just kind of a tone or something. It reminded me of something I would feel about a poem, and that was stretched into a novel. But sometimes that can be a short story. So it's not so easy. I don't think it's so easy to separate either, to give a very wonderful answer to your question.
Well, it was a mean question, so I understand. Why don't you, I mean, one thing I've had such a fun time reading your books, and one thing I was going to sort of try and draw out from each of you. Why don't I start with you, Gunnhild? I really love the first sentence of Evil Flowers, the opening line to the story Birds, and you'll soon see why, the audience, if you haven't read it. So why don't you read that and then talk a bit about how that story developed and came?
Yeah, I'll try. I think I'm going to read, dear audience, I'm going to read 7 or 8 lines. Okay, Birds. Oh, I forgot my glasses. As I sat on the toilet menstruating, a fairly large part of my brain fell down into the toilet bowl. I'd seen brains on TV, so could easily differentiate a piece of brain from a piece of mucosa. There it was, not black and lumpy, but brownish pink and shiny. I said nothing when I went back into the kitchen. I just sat down and ate my tacos as if nothing had happened. I did a few quick checks to make sure I was still functioning. Did I understand requests like, pass me the sour cream, or can I have the taco sauce, please?
So you see what I mean? So can you tell us a bit about the genesis of that story?
Yeah. Well, I think menstruation is a very interesting thing in life. It can introduce you to a lot of different stuff. For instance, things looking like pieces of rain. So I think. I was struggling with this short story because I had this idea of my short stories being a bit kind of moving in a zigzag, moving in and out of narrators, a bit, how should I put it, distracted minds. So they would kind of associate and leave their thoughts and go on to something else. And so I was trying to find a way to write about that. And so suddenly that first sentence just dropped into my head, just almost as if that piece of brain fell down into the toilet bowl. And from there on, I just knew that was the plot I needed to kind of create that kind of belonging to a body experiencing that loss of mind or loss of thought, and making it very concrete. That she loses. What happens is that she loses her. That particular piece of brain contains all her knowledge on birds, and she's an ornithologist, so that's very unfortunate for her. And she's going to defend her thesis, a doctoral thesis, in 3 weeks. So she has to figure she has very little time to kind of obtain all that knowledge. So yeah, so it was, and often it is like that. The first sentence is often what brings the story about. It kind of just comes from a place I can't really explain where it comes from.
Often the whole plot of a thing will be in that the tensions in that first sentence.
Yeah.
I really felt it in that story. With Jai, I really like the endings of your stories, and it's almost like a cliche. They talk about short stories and say, "Oh, the twist's got to work, it's got to land in this particular way." I suppose that's true of all things. They have to end in some way, everything. So I wondered if you could maybe read from the end of the second story in your collection and sort of talk a bit about how endings work for you. Like we just talked with Gunnhild how the beginning just comes. Does the end just come, or is it something you've worked for? Is it in the first draft? A little bit about that would be cool.
Yeah, sure. And I should explain this second story is about a woman in New Jersey who is trying to construct an airplane using the drawings and diagrams of an ancient 12th century mathematician. I'm going to read the ending here. I hope I don't spoil the story for you. Let's just say the plane does not fly. She stared at her air chariot on the concrete. It seemed to stare back with derision. She had used the drawings of an ancient mathematician who'd never known of Newton, of his third law of action, equal reaction. And when the miracle of flight had not come, and she was still on the ground, she did not think of Newton or Bernoulli's principle of how curves under pressure create the most important form, lift. She thought instead of that first moment when Sanjay had come out from her body and the nurse had passed him to her arms as if he were the most precious gift. And all she had thought then, as Harish looked on, weak-kneed and teary-eyed, was how ugly her little boy seemed, how covered with blood on his sagging skin. But she held him anyway, with his cave of a mouth, with his arms outstretched like a fledgling bird. So I was trying to get this idea of flight into that language. And when I think about endings generally, I mean, there's that, of course, that famous line by Flannery O'Connor that it should be surprising but inevitable that endings should work that way. And I suppose the way I have internalized it is it should be surprising for me as a writer to discover that. So that process of discovery should feel verdant. And before I was a fiction writer, I was a poet. And what I learned from poetry about endings is that you're always looking for the ineffable, right? The thing in the poem that can't quite be captured by words, but which the ending of the poem is pointing toward. All the lines are pointing in that direction, but language is insufficient to capture it. And so I think like that's what I'm sort of going for, and whether or not it succeeds, you will have to let me know.
And with Hernan, I just really love the structure of the story that you've got in Harper's triptych. Obviously, that's a three-part structure. And there's obviously Trust that's got a four-part structure too, so this is something that very clearly, and as you were explaining what you think about the story, wanting it to have sort of unmake itself while it's going along.
Yes.
And I wondered if you could maybe read us a little bit from the story and talk a bit about how that structure comes to you, what's appealing to you in it,
Sure.
and all those
Yeah,
things.
yeah. So it's my first time holding this. It's quite moving to, for a decades-long subscriber to. It's a moment.
Print magazines are special. They're cool.
So you were saying my paragraphs are long, and I'm sorry. So it's a long paragraph. It's the opening. It's the opening part. It's not that long. So this is how it begins. In an effort to replenish its anemic membership with younger blood, the New Amsterdam Club has, among other measures, relaxed its dress code, allowed the use of cell phones, and added a mezcal cocktail to the menu. Yet one unspoken rule remains unchallenged: no business talk on the premises. unless maybe in what's known as the little bar. No one would dream of discussing work in the big bar or the dining room, but the little bar is a territory with a diplomatic status and a legislation of its own. Conversations are kept brief and drinks left unfinished out of consideration for those who pretend not to be waiting outside. According to yet another tacit law, each party is given total privacy in the narrow, seatless bar. Perhaps because its regulars don't tend to be among the club's most aesthetically minded members, the issue with the sergeant hanging in a dusky corner by the little bar's entrance wasn't immediately noticed. In 1885, John Singer Sargent painted a portrait of his friend Martin Graham, a minor watercolorist with whom he traveled Scotland that summer. It may have been as an homage to Graham that the oil on Sargent's brush becomes less viscous toward the painting's edges. Light strokes, faded colors, and dissolving shapes merge into one another, somewhat resembling a watercolor, a medium that Sargent, of course, also mastered. The subtlety of this conversation between friends through different materials and forms was utterly lost in the pixelated reproduction of the portrait that had been printed on canvas and mounted in a frame that closely resembled the real thing. Eventually, someone noticed the crude forgery, but no one could say how long the original had been gone.
So that's the setup, but how?
That's the setup, yeah.
But it has this triptych, so how does the three-part structure work for you? And how did it arise?
Well, this is the first of three paintings that are stolen, and with each theft, there is also a replacement, a replica, a fake, a simulacrum put in instead of the stolen painting. And with each theft, this replica becomes sort of more essayistic in nature. It's telling us something. And then I think the big reveal of the story comes in the fourth part, where the narrator emerges, from whom we had never heard. And it turns out to be that it's a first-person story, which we learn very, very late into the story. And it was also a way. I'm very interested in authenticity, reproduction, aura, all these issues. And I also love Henry James's short stories about artists. This is something I've always loved very deeply. And even here in this passage that I just read, I managed to smuggle in The Real Thing, which is the title of a James short story about a painter. And I'm interested in as a result of my work on trust in New York society, and this is about New York institutions, very different institutions, and anyway, but it's also a bit of an arabesque. It's supposed to be a little bit funny.
And you chose the artists, so there's Sargent and there's Zurbarán and there's Twombly. Is there a particular shape to that too?
Well, Sargent comes to me via James, and the famous James portrait in the National Gallery was painted by Sargent, whose work I love. I also there is a club in New York that has an unguarded Sargent, which is where I remember being there as a guest and thinking I could steal this Sargent.
How big is it?
I could totally do it. It's small.
Because they're big,
it's like
normally.
Tote bag.
Okay.
Tote bag. Tote bag big. I could totally steal the Sargent and
Careful, now you can't.
And that was sort of the genesis of the story. Then Zurbarán, I like, but it's not. It wouldn't have been my immediate choice hadn't it been because of the Hispanic Society, in Washington Heights, which is this grand, magnificent building, chock full of masterpieces and empty, which to me is fascinating. And then Cy Twombly, I revere and adore, and the fact that his work can be perceived to be sort of childlike at times, or like doodles, is very, very important to the plot.
One of my favorite images that sticks with me is this box of crayons. I mean, I'm
Yes.
making it very, yeah, you'll enjoy the box
So
of
the
crayons.
third forgery is done with a box of crayons that is left as an insult on a mantle.
And it exactly plays on that thing of, modern art, oh, my kid could do that. It's a very...
That's right, yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you all so much for reading. I want to encourage you to talk to each other, not just to me as well. But I'll start you off. When I was thinking about this event, I was thinking of the canonical short stories, and one I particularly was thinking of was The Mark on the Wall, Virginia Woolf's short story, and how that offered her like a tiny sort of laboratory in which to try something out, that her first novels were maybe almost like on the Jamesian end, more realistic, and then obviously we know what the stream of consciousness and the stuff that she developed later. But The Mark on the Wall was like this kind of moment where she was able, literally with just a mark, to kind of experiment and do something different. And I wondered, does the short story offer you that, or offer you all that as a writer? Like, what does it sort of give you? What space, or to be different, or to be another sort of writer that you don't have, that you aren't in your other sorts of forms?
I think for me it's absolutely a space where I feel liberated, that I can do anything. And I think when I was young and I was starting to write short stories, I had this very long James Joyce period where I was trying to write Dubliners again, to rewrite Dubliners. And I was very into the how you create, and I was also a Norwegian short story writer called Alexander Kielland. He's one of, in Norway is counted as, we have the four great, Ibsen is one of them, and Kielland is another, and he is...
Who were the other two?
Bjørnson and Lee. Everybody knows that. It's like kind of... well, yeah, and I was trying to write short stories that would use the way both particularly Kielland and also Joyce would use repetition and rhythm and the tip of the iceberg, which isn't really Joyce, but also Joyce, and the implying techniques of the short story. But then I read, and this is when I was a young reader, I was reading Kafka's short stories, and that's probably what I think opened the doors to me, for me. His very, very short stories, where it's a mix of, it's almost small essays or small poems in the form of a short story, and that's kind of, to me, that was a door opener to kind of try to write, freer. So it's, and I think I still have that today, and I'm very inspired by writers who do that. And I love Joy Williams with 99 Stories of God. I think she's just a brilliant example of what you can do in the short format, and also Mary Rueful's texts, which are, I don't know how to classify them, if they are short stories or prose poems. But it's, so to me it's, I love the idea of the text as the short story as an open form. So I don't know how you feel.
Yeah, I love the openness that you're talking about, and the invitation for the form being as vast as it is. Last night I did a conversation about Bernard Malamud's collection, The Magic Barrel, that came out in, I think, 1959. And there was a definition that I heard recently about literary fiction, which is that it's the kind of fiction that's in conversation with other kinds of fiction. And I feel like that's such a marvelous definition. And one of the things that I love about, for example, thinking about Malamud's work, is this idea of being able to riff on other writers to be able to have a kind of referential experience. And in fact, there's this story by Nabokov called Signs and Symbols that Laurie Moore then takes on and creates as her own story, and she calls it referential. And in poetry, this happens all the time and very commonly, and I guess less so in fiction. But for me, the short story is also, as you were saying, like an opportunity to sit deeply with the work of a writer and then to connect with what about it am I drawn to and how might I relate to that in my own way. The last couple of stories in this book involve a character by the name of the Kabuliwala, who is a Afghani refugee. The Kabuliwala is also the name of a story written by Rabindranath Tagore, who is like for those of you who may not know him, he's the Shakespeare of Bengali letters. And so for me, it was extremely anxiety-provoking to refer to anything by Tagore, but it also felt like a really necessary thing in the way that you're talking about the Joyce experience, to wrestle with those texts and to see what of it could I find that was myself and appropriate for who I am in this moment.
Taking you up on your offer to just open up the conversation.
Yeah, do
it. I really love this book so much, and you said something about openness that to me was enacted formally. So in such strong, wonderful terms in your book. There's so many moments and so many stories where the story opens up onto the referential world. I don't know even how to put this, but if there is something like a fourth wall, it's broken. If there is something like strings, we see the puppeteer. Whatever simile that you want, but you break with that pretense of mimesis, of simulacrum, and I thought it was wonderful, and it made me think of so many authors I love. We were talking about Joe Williams upstairs, but I also thought, I don't know, of Daniel Carnes. I also thought of Muriel Spark. I also thought of, I don't know, Clarice Lispector. I mean, so many. Not so many. It's a very tiny canon of authors who do this in a canon in which I feel you really, really belong. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about these many ways in which you so beautifully destroy every preconception we have about what fiction ought to be.
No, you said it. That's what I'm trying to do, because I feel I think also I am very interested in the I'm sorry for my English. I think I'm inventing words all the time. A simulacrum. There is one short story in this collection, which is just a page long. It's called "Digressive Fit," and it's about a bear who is he has spotted I think it was a deer he's going to eat, but then he suddenly sees I was going to say a group of blueberries, a little group of blueberries, and he wants to eat them, and so the deer disappears, and he is just, oh no, why do I always? So this is the digressive. Why am I always thinking of something else? And then the narrator, a bit like in your story, turns up in the second paragraph, and it turns out to be a flock of midges circling around the bear. And that to me is kind of the image of the narrator, the hoax of the narrator is kind of this group of midges. Because I'm fascinated by the fact in fiction that you have this voice telling you about a character as if it's possible to see through and know everything about a third person or even a first person. So I think I'm trying to create a space where you can both feel the I'm thinking in Norwegian now. Well, the physicality of something, but also kind of be a distance to it.
Yes.
So that's the kind of, yeah. Well, that was an attempt to kind of talk about what you were
But it's
inviting
also
me
the
to talk about.
physicality that you're referring to applies to the physicality of language, right? Because the more you feel language, the greater your awareness of the artifice of it all, right? I would say the more distanced and removed and
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I also, well, I'm thinking it's in a different direction. There's a Danish poet called Mette Mostrup who says that if you have a very, this isn't kind of an advice, I've been teaching for many, many years in kind of, it's called the Academy of Creative Writing in Vestland. And I used to invite her, and she would talk to my students about how if you have a very warm material, meaning your personal life, you could choose a cold method. And if you have a very cold material, if you have kind of if you have, for instance, historical facts or something, you can choose a warm method, meaning kind of bringing it back to yourself. And I've always loved that because it's about how you can create kind of closeness and distance in a text. Yeah.
We're going to open it up for questions in about 5 minutes' time, but I thought before we get there, I wanted to ask you all if you have favourite short stories, and we've talked a lot about the different writers that we like, that you like, and I wondered if you might sort of pick out some few short stories that maybe we want to recommend people to read or that you just really love. Do you want to start, Hernan?
No.
Well, that's okay. Why don't we go for you, Jai? Give you some more time to think.
Are you?
Oh,
you
no, yeah.
You want the time to think? Yeah. Well, I mentioned Malamud's The Magic Barrel, so I will call out The First 7 Years, which is the first story in that collection, and
why do you like that one?
So one of the reasons that I liked that one, and I first read it when I was a teenager and understood so little about what was going on in that book, and then I've kind of reread it over the years. But there's this sort of like, and we've been talking a lot about non-traditional structures in the story, and there's of course this traditional Freytag's pyramid that talks about premise, inciting action, climax, and resolution. And what I learned from Malamud in that story in particular is that it's not that structure that is particularly effective or engaging. It's how Malamud is working with the exchanges or transference of power in that story. So that story is about a shoemaker and his assistant, and the shoemaker's assistant is in love with the shoemaker's daughter, a rich premise. But in that final scene of that story, there is this remarkable exchange of authority, giving up authority, allowing it to be, allowing someone to have that power and sort of taking it back. And it's happening sentence by sentence by sentence. And so this idea that a single scene could hold all of that, and it's not thinking about it in terms of a climax, but really thinking about it in terms of the density of human exchange. I think that story captures it. And then I learned so much about how to write fiction from Alice Munro, quite as I'm sure like many writers would agree with here. And when I think about this idea of the Watcher or the breaking of the fourth wall, even though Munro wasn't considered perhaps a great experimentalist in her own right, I think the way in which she is working with point of view is quite extraordinary, and the way in which she can get very, very close to her characters and the way in which she can then span out. And the spanning out is this nod to the eye, to the watcher, to the author. And the coming in close is, of course, the immersion, the sublimation to the character consciousness. And I think, that's something that I got from Monroe. And even though she's sort of, seen as maybe more of a traditionalist writer, I think the way she handles point of view, and how can one recommend just a single Monroe story? You should read them all.
And Anna, you use some more time to think?
Oh no, I can. No, I can go. It's just it's always hard to, as you said, just to narrow it down to one name. I have to double down on Borges, and within Borges, I would say my favorite story today is probably Death and the Compass, because it entails writing a fiction for someone else. It's a detective story of sorts. It's very strange, and it's really creating a parallel reality for a detective who ends up also being the victim of the story. So there's this critique of the genre. Since we're talking about detective stories, and I feel in a way that the short story, to some extent, is its inception in modernity is kind of married to some extent to detective fiction and the pulpiness of it all, and the way in which stories circulated for sort of in mass publications, which I find fascinating. I love Edgar Allan Poe, all of it. I think it's fantastic. And lastly, my recommendation, it's a new translation came out, I want to say last year, City Lights Books, so probably hard to find, is an Argentine author called Silvina Ocampo, who wrote these beautiful, utterly sinister, profoundly weird stories where reality becomes sort of this viscous, elastic, morphing thing, and they're very scary and very beautiful at the same time. So if you want to check that out, it's something I would recommend emphatically. Silvina Ocampo. Yeah.
Gunnhild?
Yeah, I'm panicking.
Yeah, it's not fun this part at all.
Because I have 4. I'm like, which one?
Say all 4.
Yeah, okay. It's 2 by Goll. It's The Overcoat and The Nose. I think they have been. I think they are my 2 favorite short stories, probably.
And why?
Yeah, well, it's because of. Yeah, well, it's just terrible. Well, let's take The Nose. I don't know how many have read The Nose. Yeah, it's about it's a nose. That disappears and becomes a character. I don't think I'm not going to start talking about it, but it's the absurdness made concrete and real, and how Gogol just swoops in and out of any possibilities, and how he just dictates the reader and telling the reader what to believe and not to believe. And I actually realized a novel that came out here last year, Present Tense Machine. There's a lot of, when the narrator feels that I don't really know enough about this, so I'm just gonna put some fog in here, and it's actually in the novel. I can't really see it here, so I'm just gonna go on to the next chapter. And then I reread The Nose, and I could see that I had stolen that from The Nose. I just didn't remember it, because that's also what happens at certain very important points where the narration kind of demands a logical explanation. The narrator just says, "Oh, but this is just very foggy. I just don't really know," and then so we just go on. So I think I just learned, or just took it, because it was so brilliant. And then I think The Trees is This Long by Kafka. Is probably my favorite Kafka short story. I'm not going to tell you anything about that. You're just going to have to go and find it. Yeah, and then well, no, I can go on.
You had said you had 4.
Yeah, I was going to say Eveline by James Joyce, because that is my favorite James Joyce story, about Eveline, who is it follows her a couple of hours before she is going to elope, is that a word, with her fiance, and go to Argentina, I think, on a boat. She lives a very confined life in Ireland, in Dublin, with a very alcoholic father, and she's acting as a mother for her brothers. And now she has this open door to freedom. And then if I'm telling you the ending, I'm going to spoil it.
Maybe don't.
So I'm not going to do it.
No,
but
no,
it's that's my favorite Joyce story. Yeah.
Okay. We're ready to take questions now. If anyone has got questions, and there's one just right here in the front row.
So just raise your hand, and we'll come over to you with a microphone.
Hernan, I was fortunate enough this evening to read your triptych. It's delightful, and I'm enthralled and very appreciative of you writing this short story. I'd like to know, if it became a blockbuster Broadway play, would you be in favor of pursuing that? And as an individual, would you give it over to creative other people to develop it, or would you be intriguingly involved every step of the way?
Wow, that's an amazing question.
Well, I would have to star in it, and it would be a musical, right? Gosh, I don't know. That's a short story in its own. Thank you. Thank you for reading the book. I don't know anything about the theater, so it's an embarrassment to me. So I would be completely unqualified to adapt it. But maybe let's hope someone will. I don't know. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Oh, there's one back there. But trust is being made into something, isn't it?
Yes, but again, I'm not writing.
I really appreciate your presentations. I'm not sure you may have said something about this, but I didn't really follow it. And that is, when you start the story, do you know what the story is going to be? Or does it evolve as you're writing it? Or something else about that process?
Yeah, for me, it is very much a process of organic discovery, harking to the E.L. Doctorow line of writing is like driving in the night, in the fog. And that experience of discovery is really important, because otherwise it would be very boring for me. So oftentimes, like you were saying, like there's an image or some sort of impulse, something that I can't put down, and something that I got from, again, harking back to a poetry exercise from Marie Howe, was to actually sit with the story in my head for a while before I actually start writing it. So I'll, have the first little bit of it in my head, and I'll try to even like arrange some of the lines before I actually sit down to write. And I find that gives me like a much, deeper and more honest engagement with it. But yeah, I don't know how it's going to go. I do a lot of shape drawing after the fact. I'm very into shapes, but that's a post-fact exercise to try and look at the shape of a story and try to understand its structure. But it's not something that I would want to do at the beginning. How do you think about it?
Yeah, I'm much the same. I think I just begin. As I said, it was with the first sentence, and there's always something strange, I think, with the first sentence, and I have to try to figure out who is speaking. And then I think it kind of shows itself as I go along. I think I only ever written, one short story where I knew the plot beforehand, and that is, to me, the most boring process that that's just a matter of writing it out. So it's just about I think it's the excitement of language is kind of, suddenly the cliche, the language takes over, but that's really also the thrilling part of writing, I think.
Yeah, no, I can only echo and what you guys said and say that for me there is no sort of platonic story, it's always in language. There isn't like an ideal story that then finds its form. It's one gesture, the language itself, and the arc or the diegetical sort of line that is drawn along the way. I seldom know the ending.
Yeah, there's another question sort of midway down.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
My question for all of you is, are you conscious of the peculiar or the obscure as you're writing the story? Or is that the thing that, the turn where they emerge in your stories, is that the surprise?
The peculiar, the obscure.
That's a very Gunnhildian question.
The nose.
That's a very good question, actually. I don't know how to respond to it. I think if I'm aware of the obscureness, I think that's probably what draws me into it, I think. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I will say that for me that writing stories is a very bodily experience. And so I guess I see the peculiar and the obscure as sort of like in a somatic way where I'll feel something in my stomach, and it's not indigestion. It's something about the story, and I'll think, oh, okay, that's something to pursue. So I guess I recognize it physically as like maybe a place. Do you have that experience of like sort of having a physical reaction to something in the story, or am I just
Sternum.
Sternum. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, but I was also thinking that there's something about the obscure or that's not really obscure, I think, but it's maybe more peculiar. That I sometimes have the feeling that my characters are, or the voice talking is stepping up on I kind of imagine them having this little box that they are putting on stage, and then they're putting themselves up on top of that and just start talking. And that is really kind of strange. So it's kind of obscure in just the finding the voice to begin with, I think. I don't know if that's an answer. Yeah. It was an attempt.
And did you have something to say to that?
No, I'm so grateful. No.
I feel like I've lost you.
You're working on the Broadway musical as we speak.
There's a question in the front row.
Hi, thank you all for your work. So you've each talked about influences, writing influences predominantly that impacted your work. And then you've talked about your craft and how you use it to weave deliberation and exploration into what you're producing, and the influence of that on the work itself. And so I'm wondering about how your own work has influenced you as people. If you can maybe talk about the product of your own exploration and craft and how that's impacted the way you see your lives or yourself.
Oh, okay. Since I sat the last one out, I can shall I?
Please. Yeah.
Well, there's first sort of somewhat of a commonplace answer that I still believe in. I think commonplaces can be sort of ossified, sedimented, decanted sort of truth. So I have no problem with that. And Martha Nussbaum, a philosopher, has expounded on this, sort of that the ethical dimension of fiction has to do with being able to imagine an other, right? So I think if that is your daily task, imagining others. Inevitably, if you do this in an open-eyed way, it will influence the way in which you interact with others and the way in which you lead your life. And this is also why, I am very interested myself in disappearing in what I write and make space for others. I'm not interested in literature as a selfie at all. So I think that would be my initial response, the ability of imagining others.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that sort of empathy machine that fiction can be is so awesome. And I talked earlier about like fiction as a kind of technology where you can think about, since presumably we only have one life to live, but we can think about and read about characters who are doing all kinds of crazy shit that we may perhaps not want to do and still learn something about those experiences. And I think about Zadie Smith's essay, Fascinated to Presume, which is, I think, like such a wonderful essay on this idea of the empathy machine and thinking about the other and kind of like the boundaries that you have to draw around it, but also the great privilege that comes through fiction and being able to sit down and think about who is this person that is not me, and I think like that's just really, that is the gift that I keep getting drawn to.
Yeah, I love both of your answers. I just thought that what I have created for myself is something that scares me. So I'm a bit freaked out every time I read this. I've actually now started to say the title wrong. I've started calling it, for some reason, Evil Showers. So I think it spooks me. So yeah, but I loved your answers. So yeah.
Evil Showers is the sequel.
Yeah.
I think we've got time.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
I guess this is mostly for Hernan, but I guess I'm curious about the impulse to write about the art world, because I think it's something I see a lot in modern fiction, two writers that I can think of, like Atessa Moshfegh or Ben Lerner. Like, I think there's these parallels between the literary world and the art world that inspire some writers to sort of like talk about their craft through the lens of this other craft. And I was curious if that's what drove you to write about this in Triptych, or if it's just an interest of yours, or why fine art? It's like sort of this rarefied world that literature also is. So I'm curious what the connection is.
Yeah, that's a good question. And you mentioned two writers whose work I really like, and I think they're amazing. Somehow they weren't on my mind as I was writing this, and I wasn't. Although I believe in that literature is a dialogue, they didn't happen to be interlocutors in this case. And I guess I wasn't aware of this being a thing, but I don't know. I think it's a really good question, and I'm aware the clock is ticking. I think there is, with art, the fine art, I see, to borrow your expression, I think I'm interested in it because of how highly commodified it is. That's one thing that drew me. I'm coming out of writing about money, and about class and about capital. So all those things are so visible in the fine art world. I mean, also in the publishing industry, as the cover of this issue shows us. So that's one aspect. I think, on the other hand, this, literature is made to be reproduced endlessly, and with the arts, it's this obsession with originality, and it has to be irreproducible. That's where its aesthetic value stems from, And this is something that also makes me tick. And then the immediacy and instantaneousness of the experience, the visual experience, as opposed to the more sort of diachronical, linear experience of reading, you know. So those two things, trying to capture one through the other, and they seem so antithetical, is to me also very, very interesting. And of course, there is a long, long tradition sort of this ekphrastic literature trying to capture, you know, that very experience of seeing, you know. And I think that's really beautiful. But I have to go back again to the notion of authenticity, which I think in all of its dimensions, or several dimensions, which I think is at stake in the story. Sorry I didn't do your question justice. Yeah.
And the last question?
Hi, this has been very fascinating. I'm really loving your discussions about language and voice and the ineffable. I just wanted to say that about a week ago, someone gave me a book of stories by Italo Calvino, which I was enjoying, but I found myself struggling to feel like I was reading Italo Calvino. I later decided, after about 3 stories, that it just wasn't a great translation, that I should look around for maybe a better one. But I'm just interested in, well, we're all using this language, and it's maybe an accident that we're writing in English or thinking in Norwegian, or, you know. And so how do you approach that? And what about the question of translation anyway? Like, you know, do you think about how you would be translated when you're writing a story? Or, you know, do you think your work could be translated with fidelity into other languages and have it be the same voice?
Well, I think translation is a very interesting thing. I'm very grateful for the existence of translations because it makes us able to read so many. Yeah, well, this was a very beautiful answer. But to me, I think it's very fascinating to see how the text remains the same and still has added something new. I recognize my own work in this. I love Kari Dixon's translations, and I have been able to work very closely with her on them. And yeah, I think I don't think about the translations when I write. I think that's I think that would only make me feel restricted in a way, that I was kind of thinking, how will this be translated into something else? I think that would kind of destroy my own sense of freedom. So I don't know how you feel about translations. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've been able to do a bit of translation myself, and I feel like it's such a great and nuanced question, because I think that there are certainly some versions of poetry, for example, and they are called versions in this case and not translations, where I have felt that they are quite radical departures from the original, and thinking about like Hafez, for example. And so in my own experience of translation, I am aware of just how much power you have to change how the text is conveyed and connoted. And I think about, you know, Tagore, who was his own translator in many cases, but wasn't really, I mean, so great at the English language, to be very frank. And so I think like he's someone for whom a retranslation is probably helpful. And then there are other cases where, you know, I feel like in some cases done a disservice. So I do think it has to be a conversation. It really has to be a partnership. And I feel that there's a lot of trust, no pun intended, that you have to put into your translator.
Yeah. No, I can only agree, and I love this notion of I think it's Benjamin in his essay on the translator, the task of the translator, that the richness of it all exists precisely in the gaps, in what cannot be translated, and that's where one language sheds light on the other, and it's such an experience to be able to witness that, you know. And but yeah, so much of the literature that I love, I've read in translation, you know, as I'm sure is the case with a lot of you. Yeah. Mm.
That's all we have time for. Thank you so much for your questions.
Right. Thank you all. That was wonderful. Thank you all for coming. If you have your books already, you can come in, line up here to get them personalized. And if you don't, you can go out the back doors and go to the bookstore and then come back in here.